The last thing to talk about with regard to deductive arguments is soundness. Soundness is really ultimately what our arguers are going after with a deductive argument, because soundness means that two conditions are met. One, that the argument has a valid form. In other words, setting aside what we believe, if the premises are true, the conclusion follows necessarily from those premises. So it has a valid form. It cannot be the case that the premises are true and the conclusion is false. So that's the first condition that must be met in order to achieve soundness. And then there's a second, which is just as important, is that the premises are all true. Okay, you don't want to be convinced by an invalid argument, one that has a bad form, and you also don't want to be convinced by an argument that includes false claims. So, but you do want to be convinced, a critical thinker would be open to being convinced by an argument that has a good form and all true claims. So let's consider a couple arguments here. One is, the premise is the 4th of July is always on a Monday. Therefore, the day after the 4th of July is always Tuesday. So first thing is to just recognize that this is a deductive argument. The premise gives us all the information we need to infer the conclusion as being necessarily true. Okay, that's the claim that's being made. The first thing what we would want to check for soundness is the form. So what we looked at in the last video, validity. What we're going to do is assume the premise is true. Assume that it's the case that the 4th of July is always on a Monday. Does it follow from that necessarily that the day after the 4th of July is always Tuesday? And I would say yes, that seems to follow necessarily. Okay, there's no way for this premise to be true and for the conclusion to be false. So it passes our first test. It is a valid argument. Now, the second step is to see if the premises are all true. In this case, there's just one premise. And so we need to ask ourselves, has there ever been a 4th of July that has landed on a day that has not been Monday? And if you look back at history, yes, the 4th of July does not always land on a Monday. And so this premise is false. And that gives us enough to say that even though the argument has a valid form, it fails the second test. The premises are not all true. So I would call this argument unsound for failing to have all true premises, for failing this second step here. Okay, so this is a good example of where an argument might have a perfectly good form, a valid form, and nevertheless be unsound, and we wouldn't want to be convinced by it. Okay. Now let's go ahead and change things a little bit. We will not mess with the argument's form, so we're going to keep it valid. But let's go ahead and make it, change the 4th of July to Labor Day. Now, the form of the argument has not changed because we have just substituted in a consistent way one of its terms, but the premise still, if true, would give us a necessarily true conclusion. All right, if Labor Day is always on a Monday, then the day after Labor Day would indeed always be Tuesday. Okay, so the argument checks that condition. It is a valid argument. And then we ask the second question, is the premise true or not? And to my understanding, yes, Labor Day is always set on a Monday. Okay, so it's not set on a particular day of the month. It's always a Monday. So the premise here is true, and so this second condition, that the premises are all true, is met. So we have a valid and sound argument, and so this would be a deductive argument that we, as good critical thinkers, would be persuaded by. Okay. All right, so an argument can fail in either one of these cases where, it might have an invalid form, it might have one or more false premises, and if either of those cases holds, then the argument is unsound. We only call an argument sound when it is both valid and has all true premises. So let me know if you have any questions about soundness. But in those previous videos, any example of an invalid argument that was presented would be, even if it had all true claims, would be unsound for that invalid form that it has.